every Papuan knows very well that they are seen in a certain way by the rest of Indonesia. They heard something that sounded very familiar to them, and I think it was the sound of racism. Thank you for inviting me. It's a true honor to talk to you tonight. And I have to confess, I found it a bit difficult to sit and write this history because then tell it to you, to an Indonesian audience. Of course, it should be a celebratory occasion to share with you the story of my family that has roots that are so deeply connected to this country. But as things are, of course, it actually makes me also anxious to do this in front of you because I don't know how you will take it, right? And so my story contains of 3 parts. A family history. Part 2 is called aptly Monkey. And part 3 is about mapping slavery. And so these, and that's the work I'm involved in, as I told you. And these seem separate threads, but I hope in the end that you will see that they sound maybe separate now, but they're actually deeply interconnected. So, let's go to part 1. Let's start with my family name, right? When I mention my family name to a Dutch audience and ask them what it sounds like, 90% will say Frisian. After the northern part of the Netherlands, where a proud, blonde, and stubborn group of very Dutch people reside, the Frisians. Here's some example of Frisians. Famous ice skater, famous this and that. So, in 2019, Jouwe sounds very Dutch to the Dutch, but in 1937, our family name had a very different ring to the Dutch Protestants who lived in Hollandia, which is now Jayapura, the capital city, right? Of then Dutch New Guinea. In fact, it disturbed the Protestants since our family name at the time was pronounced Jouwe. And so that sounded too much like Yahweh. The tradition, yeah, right? You see the problem. The traditional name for the God of the Old Testament in the Bible. And so my family was ordered to change the name because this definitely sounded too uppity, too arrogant. So a family consultation was held all day, and after much deliberation, my ancestors decided to add the letter U, probably because it still had some proximity to the actual family name. And this is why, for 82 years now, our family name sounds Frisian rather than godlike. My family was basically put in their place by the Dutch church. So much was clear. This, of course, all happened while I was sort of a twinkling star up in the sky. And when I was born in 1967 in the Netherlands, my longing to see the place my parents had come from grew stronger. And as I became an adolescent, that sort of became a real thing. But already as a kid, Indonesia was ever present in my life. I had a childhood that consisted of eating rice and cooked potatoes, tempeh and kale, peanut sauce on vegetables, and peanut butter on bread, and the occasional papeda with fish sauce. In short, a household where Dutch, Papuan, and Indo-European cultures mixed, combined, and also clashed. My cousins from my mother's side loved to come and eat at our place because my mother could cook Indonesian and Indo-European food so well. It would ignite all sorts of feelings of nostalgia connected to being part of a culture without a country, since the Dutch East Indies did not exist anymore. When my mother's brothers would sit in the living room with my parents, the room would fill up blue and thick with pipe smells, cigarettes, and cigar smoke. Around our kitchen table during family meals, the conversations were not about reports or grades from school or family outings we might plan. The talks would always be about international politics. And in a typical patriarchal fashion, we would listen as our father spoke. And we understood as children that it was important to my father to have an audience. My brothers would get bored, though. They did not like to hear the same story over and over again. I, on the other hand, I wanted to know what it was that I was curious, basically, what the look in my father's eyes was whenever he would talk about Papua. I wanted to know what it was that he saw. These are my parents. And so my first trip to Indonesia was in 1992. I was 25 and elated. My parents were very, very worried that I wanted to go. After all, Suharto was in power. My father had been an exile from Indonesia. So yes, he moved, but he moved because he basically otherwise would have been killed at the time. So he had been in exile for 30 years. But I pushed through and I came here. And so after landing in Jakarta, I traveled as quick as I could to Mount Bromo first, and then onwards to Solo, to walk around the city where my mother was born. And Solo was a magical city to me, with a magical ring to it. In fact, the city where my mother was born. The city seemed dilapidated, but all I could see was the magical town with its beautiful women, perempuan halus. It was like seeing my mother in every female citizen. After that unique experience, I traveled to Papua, where I met what looked like at least 200 people with the same last name, Jouwe, my family. And I remember the physical response of my body rather than my mind when setting foot on Papuan soil. I felt the earth creep into my feet and legs, the distinct feeling of an energy creeping up into my body, as if the earth said, "Child, you are home." And having been to the birthplace of both my parents, I could now see them as human beings, instead of them just being mom and dad, right? And I decided that their marriage was a miracle. And I wrote to them how I admired their choice to actually marry each other. My trip was referred to as going back, but in fact I was the bungsu, right? I was the one born in Delft in the Netherlands. It was my mother, my father, and my older siblings, all my brothers, who were born in either Java or Papua. So I was born in the diaspora, a term used for those wandering around the globe while being displaced as a community. And as a child, I lived in a house with family members who felt lost and shared an unspoken message with me that there is no home in the world. How did this all come about? My father, Nicholas, the oldest son of a Papuan tribal leader, Pieter Jouwe, had been picked out by the Dutch to become part of a group of promising young Papuans, Papuan men that is, that would build up a new nation. Papuan nationalism and education became part of his daily staple. And within that process, a big step was taken early on. In 1949, my father became part of a delegation of Papuans chosen to be observers during the Round Table Conference in the Netherlands. He was 25. It was October 1949. And so here you see the two leaders of the opposite delegations, of course. As it so happened, my mother already lived in The Hague with her family. Her grandfather, my grandfather, her father, had retired in 1929 as the assistant district officer in Java, I think Samara. Quite a high-ranking position for an Indo-European man in the Dutch East Indies. And my grandfather did not make it through World War II, but my mother, my grandmother, and my mother's siblings did, even offering a hiding place to a Jewish man. So my mother was asked to do some translating and other odd jobs around during that roundtable conference. And when my father saw my mother, he boasted to his fellow Papuans that he would one day marry her. At that time, he did not really speak Dutch very well, but he learned quickly because he had fallen in love. And eventually they would marry in The Hague in 1953. And 2 years later, my mother would accompany my father to Dutch New Guinea, where two older brothers were born, Denny and Nico. So, here's Mohammed Hatta delivering his first speech during that roundtable conference. Now, life in New Guinea was dynamic and eventful. The Papuans thought they were going towards a process of self-determination. Papuan nationalism became a reality of sorts, instigated by the Dutch. A flag was designed by my father, the Morning Star flag, and you probably all know it. And while this happened, the international political arena talked about very different things pertaining to Papua. It should become part of Indonesia, from Sabang to Merauke, as Sukarno repeatedly had said. So, when in 1962 the Indonesians and the Dutch were on the brink of a war, the issue was settled diplomatically in New York through the New York Agreement. The next important step would take place in 1969 with the Act of Free Choice, supposedly a people's referendum, but only 1,025 chosen people voted unanimously to become part of the Republic of Indonesia. And this is why my father, mother, and brothers landed in Amsterdam in August 1962 in Schiphol. I hardly saw my father as a child, but I would get postcards from faraway places such as New York, where he was lobbying, and he would bring amazing presents from fancy places for his little girl, me. So, the Morning Star flag is now used by Papuans to express their feelings and is seen by the Indonesian government, of course, as an act of separatism. This is the current reality. We all know it. And some of you probably know this, but I wonder how many Indonesians actually really know about Papua and the Papuans. Like, for instance, how many of you actually have been in Papua? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah, that's 10% maybe. I'm entering the second shorter part of my story called Monkey. So when Papuan students were called dogs, animals, and most of all monkeys in the month of August, so 2 months ago, on August the 17th in Surabaya, people reacted throughout Papua. Every Papuan knows very well that they are seen in a certain way by the rest of Indonesia. They heard something that sounded very familiar to them, and I think it was the sound of racism. A sound not new to them. And I'll share an anecdote with you that shows this, the historical roots. So when my father came to the Netherlands together with Marcus Kashepo and other members of the Papuan delegation in 1949, they were led by Commissioner van Eekhout, the Dutch, and they had a talk with the Dutch Minister of International Affairs, Van Maarseveen. They had an official meeting at his ministry. So Van Maarseveen was also the chair of the Dutch delegation, as I said, during the Round Table Conference. So this is that delegation again. Go too fast. Right. And so that's Van Maarseveen. And so Van Maarseveen said, "Gentlemen, what surprises me," this is talking to the Papuan delegation, "what surprises me is that you do not want to become a part of Indonesia. You have all been under Dutch command, you are people of the East, and you speak the same language. Why do you not want to join the Republic of Indonesia?" Then Johan Arix, the eldest member of the Papuan delegation, spoke. "Your Excellency," he said, "I take it you do not know about the relationship between the Papuans and the Indonesians. It happens now and then that Indonesians are against us. They do not consider us to be humans. They think of us as animals. I will give you an example. In 1918, I lived in Depok. We were with 20 Papuans living there and going to school. We partook in music, sports, and went to school, learning math, calculus, and language. And we were doing really well. But at the end of our second year, our grades declined. Our teachers were astounded. How was it that the Papuans did not do well? The teachers did not talk to us right away, but instead wanted to investigate the situation. And at a certain point they asked us, "Why did all your grades go down?" Then I told him, "Yes, sir, we have been used as slaves by the Indonesian students, fellow students. We had to clean their houses, brush their shoes, wash their clothes, set their tables, make their food. But who gives these orders? Indonesian students. We have not asked this, sir, but if we would not do it, then they would kill us," they said. The teachers were upset about this news. They called the Indonesian students to their quarters and asked if the story was true. "Yes, sir, these are Papuans. They are black people. You and the Americans and Europeans have sold them as slaves. In the West, to America, to Suriname. Why can't we use slaves? If you won't allow us to use slaves, then we will ask Indonesian leaders about this in the People's Council at the Dutch East Indies. How come we cannot use Papuans as slaves? The Dutch trade them all over the world." When the teachers heard this story, they became very afraid. The matter was discussed with Dutch officials in Batavia, and it was decided the Papuans should leave and wait for a school to be opened in Tobelo, Halmahera. So the Papuans left for Sorong to await the opening of the school in Tobelo. But the Moluccans had a similar response to the Papuans. Arix concluded his story to Minister Van Maarseveen with the words, "Your Excellency, we've never had monkeys in New Guinea. We don't know these animals, yet our people are called monkeys." It was my father who remembered this story by Johan Arix and was also present during the exchange. And what strikes me is that all parties involved knew certainly about colonial history lessons very well and made their own conclusions on what it meant to them or how they could use it to their own advantage. So I'm now going to part 3. Entering the third part, I would like to share with you some stories about the Dutch history of slavery, since these Indonesian students already know it so well. The Dutch history of colonization implicated at least 4 continents and lasted for almost 4 centuries. It impacted the lives of millions of people from all over the globe. People were subjugated enslaved or endured forced labor and were treated and seen as lesser people, or not even. Despite this magnitude, or maybe because of its magnitude and violent content, Dutch colonialism is hardly at all part of our curriculum, in the Netherlands, that is. Well into the 21st century, slavery was mostly taught in Dutch schools as an American issue, rather than a Dutch part of history. We heard about Uncle Tom's Cabin, but we did not hear that the Dutch were global market leaders, to use a capitalist term, in the slave trade during the 1650s until the 1670s. So the earlier mentioned Indonesian students in 1918 Depok were apparently better informed than many Dutch people from my generation. This shows that history is not innocent and never neutral or objective. In 2010, public intellectual Anil Ramdas wrote in a Dutch newspaper that slavery was handled in a heartless and resentful manner in the Netherlands. We were not able to feel any empathy towards this history as a nation, despite the Afro-Caribbean voices that claimed acknowledgement for this shameful and bitter past. Luckily, things have changed since this decade. And in 2013, the abolition of slavery in the Dutch Caribbean, 150 years ago, was commemorated. Side note, nobody bothered to pay attention to the fact that slavery was officially being abolished in the Dutch East Indies in 1860. And since then, the Netherlands has started to become aware. Unfortunately, notably since 2015, more attention is now given to the fact that even the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or the Dutch East India Company, had a slavery system set up. There was an Indian Ocean slavery system with people from South Asia, Africa, and other parts of the Dutch East Indies who worked as enslaved people on nutmeg plantations in Banda, for instance, in households here in Batavia, or the slave mines in silver mines in Sumatra. So when Professor Gloria Wekker, who's an anthropologist, published her book White Innocence in 2016, it created a bit of a storm in the Netherlands with a ripple effect well into Europe and even the US. In her book, she shifted her gaze towards the Dutch themselves. She shifted the gaze within, you could say. As a cultural anthropologist, she decided not to look at the exotic other in faraway places, and instead to look at dominant ways of self-representation of the Dutch. The main thesis of her book was, how is it possible for a nation, the Dutch nation, that has been a formidable imperial power for close to 400 years, to imagine that this history will not have left traces in culture, in language, in knowledge production, and its conception of the self and the other. She called her book White Innocence to articulate a dominant Dutch sense of self, characterized by the centrality of a mostly silent but self-flattering conception of whiteness. It also meant that race has, by dominant consensus, been declared missing in action in the Netherlands, for we do not do race. Wekker points out that this white innocence, she calls, is activated by the Dutch in several ways. One, a foregrounding of being a victim rather than a perpetrator, for instance in the Dutch East Indies. A tendency to stress positive aspects of empire, the VOC mentality, not the violence, racism, or injustice. And thirdly, to forget or gloss over and not working through the imperial past. And it was only after I turned 43 that I decided to take on Dutch slavery as a topic that I wanted to pursue more in depth. I was clearly influenced by the organization of the Dutch curriculum and its absence of a firm knowledge base, that handled the Dutch colonial past more critically and thoroughly. But a second reason for starting late on talking about slavery is that it is a topic that you can only take on when you are ready for it. The writer Colson Whitehead won a Pulitzer Prize, the American writer Colson Whitehead won a Pulitzer Prize for his book The Underground Railroad, which centerized slavery in the US, and it came out in 2016 and that was his 7th book. Only when he was well into his 40s was he ready to write this fictional account of a true history. So I do not know if slavery is part of my family heritage. It might well be, but in a way I don't find it that important because I consider it to be a topic which affects us as a humanity deeply. It is important to have empathy with this story, and something Dutch people, especially Dutch white people, thoroughly lack. And I'm part of a research group called Mapping Slavery. I already mentioned it. It was established in 2013. It's a public history project. So basically, a way to accessibly talk about this issue, right? And it focuses on mapping, so on visualizing in maps the legacy of Dutch history of slavery and how that history has left many marks and traces in the Dutch landscape. Our website, mappingslavery.nl, shows maps from different cities with locations that carry a history connected to slavery. And so these are some of the publications that we've done. So the collective memory of the Netherlands has long focused on the glory of the Golden Age. In our last publication, the Netherlands Slavery Heritage Guide, we reveal a different perspective on that era. We show 100 locations connected with the legacy of enslavement in all of the Dutch provinces, not only in cities like Amsterdam and Middelburg. What I have on that? Yeah, here's the map. Yeah. And so, for instance, in the city of Delft, where I was born, known for its Delft blue pottery, the Dutch East India Company was the city's largest employer during parts of the Golden Age. The guide also provides several points, personal histories, and shows the global colonial footprint of the Dutch in the world. And this notion of the VOC mentality is still used in city marketing. So in my own hometown, Delft, I saw this sticker called "Step into the Golden Age," right? Or the Golden Century. So it's definitely still seen in a very positive way. But also, one of the stories that we share in our book is the story of these two Ashanti princes, Kwame and Kwasi, who were basically given to the Dutch as collateral to give thousands of soldiers to the Dutch for them then to serve in the Royal Dutch Indies Army. So here again you see all these stories being implicated together. But let's also, for instance, look at Wange from Bali, who was actually not from Bali. He was born in Flores. And he was called Nai. Because his mother was enslaved, he too, as a child, was automatically enslaved, and his father did not have enough money to buy him free, and then as a child he was sold to several Dutch owners. And Jan Hendrik Bagelaar then buys Wange on March 3, 1808 for 90 silver Dutch coins. His master is a commander on a ship fighting off the English. After that eventful period, Wange is shipped off to Europe with his owner Bagelaar, where he ends up via Paris in the town of Delft, my birth town. He's left there to live and serve the sister of his owner, and Wange learns to read and write, and is even baptized in the Church of Delft in 1818. And it is probably during this occasion that he is then portrayed by Ernst Willem Jan Bagelaar. So we actually have a picture of an enslaved person in the Netherlands from the Dutch East Indies, which is quite unique. And this is a picture of his daughter, Petronella. The portrait of Wange is now part of the collection of the Rijksmuseum, so we have an idea of how he looked like, but what is even more astounding is that Wange wrote his memoir. So we know a bit of what he thought and how he felt. He married, had children, and died in Delft, luckily a free man. And his descendant, Ron Citeur, has unearthed the story of Wange and now shares it with the world, and I'm happy he did. Actually telling him he should write a book. Matthias, if you can say the same, then maybe you'll do it, right? Okay, so to conclude now. You've heard snippets of my family history, an anecdote from the colonial Dutch Empire where all parties involved knew what was meant when referring to a monkey, and I shared some insights on the Dutch history of slavery. These stories are actually deeply interconnected. They are connected through a system of colonialism, a system of beliefs on how we see each other and what the impact of these ideas and beliefs are on people's lives. Forgotten histories are important to unpack. We need to expose them to ourselves, our eyes, our hearts, and our souls. This festival itself has attested to that importance, and I think that is enormously important because it makes us understand ourselves and each other better. Family histories have an impact on several generations, as we've heard throughout this festival. And as descendants, we have the choice to bury these stories or awaken them. And due to our choices, we come to realize that the personal is political. And my final call to you is, take an interest in Papua. Consider them your equals. They are, after all, citizens of this country, and you share a difficult and complex yet rich history. Thank you.